Hello, and welcome to Overcoming Polarisation, Paths to Common Ground, the podcast series from Debating Europe, Friends of Europe's Citizen Engagement Unit. As always, I'm your host, Sabina Shanku. And on this week's episode, we have a pretty special thematic one with the occasion of the International Day of Democracy, celebrated on the 15th of September. That's Monday. Let's face it. Europe is feeling fractured. Whether it's politics, climate, tech, or trust in institutions, more and more people are feeling left out, unheard, and uncertain about the future. But what if we could flip the script? What if instead of fueling division, we looked for common ground? In this series, we're diving into the real issues behind polarization. Economic inequality, climate anxiety, digital disruption, and we're bringing together voices from across the spectrum, whether it's policymakers, activists, business leaders, and most importantly, citizens' voices via our latest study, Voices for Choices. We're not just talking problems, we're exploring solutions that are fair, inclusive, and built to last. And before we go into our discussion, I think it would be a great opportunity to bring in some of the stats from our study, because I think they speak volumes about the moment that we are finding ourselves in. So polarization was a really big undercurrent of our study, and it really seeped into everything. And the young people from the 5 European countries that we conducted our study in, which is France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and Denmark, they're really suspicious of national governments and politicians and their role in polarizing the society around them. Responsibility levels when it comes to national governments range from 41% in Denmark to 65% in France, which really shows that around half of young people are disillusioned with domestic leadership across Europe. So beyond just looking at the system, it's politicians specifically that young people see as responsible. So 91% of Polish people, 84% of the French, 81% of Italians, and 78% of Germans see politicians as the main drivers of polarization, but only about 44% of Danes agree. And then social media and traditional media are also seen as agents of division. Russia has also left its mark on sentiments in Europe. 42% of Germans and 35% of Polish people see Russia as a divisive actor, but only between 10 and 14% of French, Italians, and Danes believe the same. And to go into some quotes that I think really symbolize a lot of the qualms that young people have with the current political system and the drivers of polarization, I think it's, for instance, one of the big problems is that they struggle to exercise their democratic muscle. One of our participants from Denmark said, and I quote, "I think many young people lack the necessary skills, especially when it comes to the European Parliament elections. We've had school elections in Denmark, which really made a difference for me. They made politics feel less mysterious. But the EU still feels abstract and difficult to access. It should be made easier to understand what it's all about." And I really agree. And the statistics also agree. Across the board, European elections have lower participation rates than national parliaments and presidential elections. Another issue that young people have is the fact that they've lost the third spaces where they can freely come into contact with other ideas and discuss in a maybe less judgmental way. So one of our participants from Germany said, "We hardly have any spaces for discourse. Youth centers, places for political education, that's where funding has been cut in recent years." And I think that's where austerity will, in the coming years, will also have an impact if we're going to add to that. To give you one last quote that I think has a bit of an optimistic outlook on the current struggles that we have in addressing things together as a community. One of our participants from Denmark said, "No one likes having top-down decisions forced on them about how to eat, travel, or consume. But if we're equipped to understand the challenges we face and feel part of the solution, especially in communities where we say, this isn't just my responsibility, it's ours, then yes, it may hurt a little, but it's easier because we're in it together." And I think that's a wonderful base to go off of in discussing with our experts on polarization. So if you're ready to hear thoughtful conversations that go beyond the headlines and into the heart of what's dividing us and what could bring us back together, stick around. This is Overcoming Polarization. Let's get started. My two guests today join me from actually across the pond. They're both speaking to me from America. We have Alison Goldsworthy. She is an expert on polarization and movement building, also a lecturer at Stanford and the chair of the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust. My other guest is Matthew McWilliams. He's the public opinion lead at the Foundation International Comms Hub in Spain and a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund. He's been studying democracy and authoritarianism through public opinion since the 1980s. So I think we've got some wonderful discussions ahead of us. We'll start with our interview with Alison. In your book, Poles Apart, Why People Turn Against Each Other and How to Bring Them Together, you start by explaining where people's views come from, the theory and the rather messy practice in which they operate. Now, this is the basis of the series that we're doing here with Debating Europe, trying to figure out where this is coming from and all of the ways in which it influences our lives. So would you be able to explain that to our listeners?
Yeah, so I suppose the first things it's worth sort of distinguishing between is our attitudes and our beliefs and our worldviews, because one falls into another. Our attitudes are they're the least set and the least fixed. Our beliefs become a bit more fixed and our worldviews become really very fixed. So that could be a worldview on whether people get treated very fairly or, if I think about some of my fairly fixed views that democracy is the best way of running a country, someone's not going to be able to change that. But my attitudes, for example, to what food I will eat can change quite over my lifetime. But I think the point is about how your views are shaped and what they're formed. They're quite messy. So when people look for simple explanations about what's happening, that's kind of a fallacy, really. So everything can influence where our beliefs come from some of our genetics, to how that then interacts with the environment around us, to what can be triggering in that environment, to our own experiences. And our brain is very good at some points at remembering what's happened and affecting how we behave as a consequence, but also persuading us that that might not be why we are behaving as we are behaving. Because where we have things that appear illogical in our brains, it likes to try and, almost in effect cognitive dissonance, where our behavior doesn't make sense with what our brain is thinking. It will come up with all sorts of ways to try and bridge that divide and make us feel like we are being consistent and coherent in what we are doing and how we're behaving. And almost all of us, myself included, are very frequently not. So I suppose that's one of the things to think about how your beliefs then interact with your behavior and how they are shaped and formed both by who you are and how you're made, but by the environment around you. And I think lots of people will often talk about is this nature or is it nurture? And it's not, it's both. It's how one interacts and triggers with the other.
That's so interesting. And I can see how, the smallest things that can happen along the way can end up building all of these bridges and different convictions that are hard to grasp in a way, but that influence their everyday lives.
And also it can make you quite rigid in your thinking. What's called cognitively rigid, you can find it quite harder to update your beliefs. So there's a whole growing band of research that looks at, people who are politically active often hold some of the strongest views. And that's not a bad thing, those are people who often change the world or safeguard democracy or all of those kind of things. I'm not having a go at people for having those hard views, but it does mean that when the situation changes, they can find it really tricky to update their beliefs or their positions, those kind of worldviews that they have. And so you can accidentally, by being politically active or around other people who are politically active, become a polarizer yourself. And those dogmatically held views, people find it really hard to update and believe. And when I'm talking to people about polarization, particularly progressives, I'm like, well, how flexible are you? How easy do you find it to update? And if you don't find it easy to update or to change your mind, then how can you have a go at some people who might disagree with you who also find that? You should actually be able to find something in common with them around that and go from there. And it's one of the things I think about a lot in terms of movement building, which was what I used to do. I used to try and persuade people to join a certain team or a camp. Polarization, we might come on to this, is very much about camps often rather than what you think on a policy position. It can much more often be actually about the group that you belong to or you do not belong to. When you build a movement, you're basically building people into a group. And when you start doing that kind of thing and building things around an identity, political or otherwise, it does mean that people find it harder to be cognitively flexible and to update their views if different information comes along. And I feel tremendously guilty that when I used to build those huge movements and groups of people, I never for 1 second thought about the consequences of what I was doing and what that might accidentally do to undermine democracy, whilst all at the same time thinking I am doing amazing things for democracy. I am signing millions of people up to campaigns on a very regular basis and I'm winning things, I'm changing things. And I never thought, oh my God, how much might I be reinforcing silos or perceptions, negative perceptions of other people? And I think I should just spend a second for your listeners to talk about the difference between issue-based polarization and effective polarization. So issue-based polarization is where you disagree on an issue. So, for example, you could say, I believe in free trade, or I do not believe in free trade, or something like that. Whereas effective polarization is where something is based on a group identity. And that is the difference between saying, if I'm in the UK, I'll say someone saying, I believed in staying in the European Union and I am a Remainer, or I am a leaver. Once you start saying I am, something's become part of your identity and who you are, and it triggers a whole different set of thought processes, which involve favouring your in-group and not favouring your out-group. So you can actually hold quite similar views on a topic, but if you think somebody is from a different group to you, then you are quite likely to discriminate against them and in favour of your own group.
I think that's a great point to go from into my next question about motivated reasoning, which is something that really stood out to me in reading some of your book. So the definition that you set out there that was put out by Professor Gary Marcus is that we tend to accept what we wish to believe with much less scrutiny than what we don't want to believe. How does this fuel the kind of propaganda that inflames groups or individuals against each other?
Being told we're right generally feels nice. Which is, or being like, oh, well, of course I was correct on this issue. So you're likely to uprate things that tell you that you're great and downrate things that tell you that you're bad. And that can be, that I don't mean that in a very egotistical way, though sometimes that's how it plays out. That can be, you're just feeling uncertain about the world, right? And there's a lot to feel uncertain about at the minute on a macro and a micro level. And so someone's saying, actually, the way you were interpreting the world was right, and giving you that certainty can be tremendously reassuring and make you feel good. And your brain is giving you certainty in uncertain situations to make you feel more comfortable. It's something your brain craves, right? And it can almost be addictive, that kind of feeling.
Exactly. And there's so many things going on. People are bombarded on the internet with information and disinformation and opinions and takes from everyone. It makes sense that beyond just the fact that algorithms are pushing us in different directions, that people simply don't want to hear from someone who is disagreeing with them.
Polarization is not a new thing, right? And I'm talking to people in Europe here, not people in America. And, I think it is a disservice to history to pretend that polarization and its occasionally truly horrific consequences are caused just by social media, because it's not like it never happened before social media existed. And it is so convenient for there to be a big baddie to blame and for that to be social media. But I sat actually at a Friends of Europe event where there was a very senior speaker, very, very senior speaker from one of the Balkan countries talking. And he literally said, well, the reason we're all so divided, and he held up his phone. And I sat there and I just thought, hey guys, right? In the 90s, you all went to war with each other and really polarized from being all brotherhood and unity in Yugoslavia to polarizing without mobile phones and without social media. And you think this is the only reason that it's happening? Seriously? Do you have any responsibility as a leader about any of your other government policies that could possibly creating this?
Thank you so much for showing that it's, it's a current problem, but it's a perennial problem, and we should treat it with its historical causes and manifestations in mind, applied to the unique situation today. In our Voices for Choices study, it was revealed that with young people, their friends are usually their main confidants for political discussions. But in general, many young people try to avoid political discussions with friends and family, and even online where you have this veil of anonymity. And politics is one of the things that divides people the most. And it's still it's something very important that maybe we should discuss in our lives. Maybe it's good to not be closed up over it. So I'm wondering, should contentious conversations be something that we have with our close ones? Would this heal divisions or would it further them?
We did some work which looked at often the workplace can be a situation where people meet people from different walks of life. And they will work on a shared project. Almost inevitably, that is what work involves, even if it is another PowerPoint presentation or someone saying, like an older person like me being, or as I'm now older and in my 40s, being like, so how can I use this AI tool to record my meetings and get auto notes? And like, why is Midjourney doing this really weird thing? Please help me, young person. Or what's this thing that someone's just said? Like, I remember being at work, the point when I identified that I was no longer young. And I said to my team that I led, I was like, oh, I'm off. They were like, what are you doing tonight? It's like, oh, I'm off home to go and see, spend the night with the man who's now my husband. And I said, oh, I think we're just going to Netflix and chill, thinking that meant that you are going to watch Netflix and chill out. And I then had to send an email to HR to explain that I had accidentally told all of my team that I was going home to like get it on with my husband, which also, even more frustratingly, was not even what was planned that night. And go from there. And I say that because the reason I highlight it is, one, the group you think you might be in, you might not any longer be in. Two, there was a power dynamic in my team then telling me, like, do you realize what you've accidentally just told us? Three, the role of humor in being a really, really good bridge builder. Four, like, workplace, meaning that when you have those shared experiences, I still occasionally get these messages from my old work colleagues talking about the time I accidentally told them I was going home to Netflix and chill. And my old boss, who also couldn't stop laughing, but she didn't know what it meant either. She did not. I sent a message around my entire management team. I was like, do not tell people you are going home to Netflix and chill, right? But like what I say is those shared experiences that you have can be tremendous bridge builders. So you don't always have to talk about politics, but I can tell you now, those conversations I had that meant it was easier to be like, oh, we are like people from different backgrounds, like we can have some of these tricky conversations. So I think it is tremendously important, and it will become a distinguishing life skill for people to be able to engage with difference, and something that will set leaders apart if they are able to do that. And if we don't all start learning to do it, then obviously you start engaging with only people like you, and that can be a very successful short to medium term route to power, and a very awful thing to do for the future of society. And the reason I say that is actually like admitting you were wrong, or you don't know, or like language or things have changed, can be a really loosening experience on your cognitive rigidity. And it can show as an example to other people it's okay for them not to know things as well. Because otherwise, not knowing things can feel really tremendously risky, I think. But for them to say, actually, I don't know, or I'm not certain about this, that's okay. That suggests to me you've got some critical thinking. So we use the example in the book, actually, of Margaret Thatcher, who I'm from South Wales. It's not an area that's noted for its love of Margaret Thatcher. She closed a lot of coal mines there, whether that was right or wrong. But like, it was a very divisive decision taken by the UK government. But when it came to foreign affairs, Maggie had like almost no experience when she came to power in 79. And what she did was she got a bunch of experts, particularly on the former USSR, and got them all together to say like, okay, tell me about what's going on here. I don't know very much. And they were able to say to her, hey, there's this guy, Mikhail Gorbachev, and I think he could be different. And she was like, okay, yeah, you've persuaded me of this case, a guy called Archie Brown, who's Labour leading. I really recommend his book, The Myth of the Strong Leader. She then was able to use her leverage with Reagan to say, look, I think our intelligence is telling us Mikhail Gorbachev is a man with whom you could do business, was precisely what she said. And Reagan then credited her with ending the Cold War a year or two earlier and changing his view on things. And a lot of that happened because Maggie didn't go in and say, I know everything about foreign policy. She went, I don't know. And I'm going to hold back from having a public opinion until I've spoken to the experts. And I think that's the other thing that I would say about social media is it encourages us very often to have a public opinion. And once you've had a public opinion, not only does it trigger like this group-based identity, not just in like how you perceive yourself, like I support such a campaign, other people will perceive you in that way. It also makes it even harder to roll it back, and to say, oh, the facts have changed. I need to update myself on this. And you can see that playing out, for example, in all sorts of conflicts around the world. I'm sure people will have that. And once you've taken some of those public positions that are not nuanced, particularly if you're ill-informed on it, then it can be very, very hard.
So this episode was about the causes of polarization. One of our next episodes will focus on what brings people together. And so without stealing the thunder from the people who are going to give solutions in the upcoming episodes, What is your suggestion of the practices that work in bringing people together, besides the ones that we've already discussed? And what chance do these have in today's world?
Some of them work on an individual, some on a group, and some on a leader, sort of a societal level. And I suspect you're going to come on to talk on to some of the societal basis. So I'll focus on something that people can do practically for themselves and a bit of like a trick that our mind can play on us. So as we've touched on a few times, our brains tend to think that they know often a lot more about an issue than they do know about something. If people are familiar with the Dunning-Kruger curve, you know, what like this point where you think you know lots about an issue and you'll often pronounce on it and pontificate. And I just want to confirm this happens to people from all sides of the political spectrum on the whole. And then suddenly you realize that you don't know so much and you go into like a trough of despair or like doubt, and then you rise up again sort of over a period of time, how long you've been thinking about it. But most people just stay in like that very initial point because most of us don't spend all of our days thinking about complex issues because like we've got lives to lead and there's only so many things you can think about. But there's something called the illusion of explanatory depth, which is how do you start to recognize that either your experience might be not typical and you're overly wedded to it, or there might be something going on that you don't know about in what's happening. And if you ask yourself how something has happened, or ask other people how something has happened and how it goes different stages, it becomes much easier for them to say, oh, I don't know, or maybe my experience was not typical, than if you say why. And so like I will often use the example to people, like if you say to someone, do you know how a zip, or if I'm in the US, a zipper works, like when you're doing a top up? People say, yeah, of course I know how it works. You know, you put one bit into another and then you pull it up and like then you're hopefully a little bit warmer than you were beforehand or covered up or whatever it is. And then you say, no, how does it actually work? Like how do the different teeth integrate into each other and how does that happen? And like, what's the bit going on at the bottom that pulls the zip in? And people will be like, oh, I'm not sure I know that. Or if I say to someone, how does a refrigerator work? People will be like, I know how a fridge works. It keeps food cold. This doesn't work with my husband, who's an engineer and appears to know the answer to everything. Most people, though, who are not engineers can't do that. And suddenly they'll be like, oh, maybe there's something going on here that I didn't know about that I could go. And once you hit that nirvana point, that is the point where you can have discussions and do other things. And you can recognize that your view, it doesn't mean that you are wrong, but it just means that you might not know everything, or there might be people having a different experience. So I use that when I say to people, someone's got a worldview, I'll be like, how did you come to that? Like, what went on that made that your belief? And you might find at that moment that they have had an experience that really formulated that you had not thought of. And that can be on a one-to-one level, like tremendously powerful. The how to ask yourself and to ask others. And like I say, the posh name for it is the illusion of explanatory depth, if people want to go and do things. If there was one message I would leave your listeners with, it's our behavior, and that can lead to polarization, is a consequence of how we are wired and the environment that we operate in. It's really hard to change how you're wired. Not impossible, actually, and more possible than people used to think it is, but really tricky. Think about like changing your habits, like going to the gym or giving up how easy would it be to give up sugar or alcohol or all of those kind of things. Whereas actually to change the environment can then make it easier to change those habits. You take alcohol out of the house, because you've changed your environment and you've probably made it much easier to give it up. You stop going into bars, you do that. Or like the mindful drinking movements, I'm just using this as an example because it's probably one that people find it relative, but also because it's easier for people to reach for, I think. But like you go into a bar and it's got the option of alcohol-free stuff. Like there's some really powerful behavior change things that I would encourage people to look at and see what they could apply into different bits of polarization.
Thank you so much, Alison, for your insights. And now on to my conversation with Matthew. Since this episode centers on the things that divide people, one of, let's say, the things that has captivated people across the world last year in the biggest electoral year in history was the fact that a lot of people, and especially young people, have lost their faith in democracy. A statistic you've quoted in your writing before is that just 41% of Americans 18 years of age and older today are consistent supporters of democracy. And to give an example from my own country, Romania, from a study by Globsec released at the end of last year, 41% of young Romanians believe that a totalitarian government without regular elections would be good for their country. Now, as you pointed that out, but the next year they clarified the question in the study that they did in 2025 to say specifically that it involves that this is what a totalitarian government implies. And the numbers dropped to about 30%, which is still significant. What impact does this lack of faith have on democracy's effectiveness, and how does this contribute to greater social divisions?
Well, it is fundamental to both of those issues. And let's roll back and look at the data just for one sec. The average in the United States of consistent support for democracy coming off of national polls, and we measure this with 5 questions, is 41% in the United States. So it's less than majority, kind of shocking, right? But underneath that, there's something that is even more disturbing and goes right to the point you made about younger people. And that is, if you're looking at 18 to 29-year-olds in the United States, just 26% of them are consistent supporters of democracy. 30 to 39, 24%. So average 18 to 39, 25% of young Americans are consistent supporters of democracy. Now, this creates a gigantic problem. And that problem is unrecognized right now. We're all thinking about vote, vote, vote. And that we'll find out is the wrong thing to think about. That creates a problem called demographic succession. And that is, as older people like me die, we are replaced by younger people who are less supportive of democracy. So the hypothesis here, which is a fact, actually, statistically proven fact in the United States and Europe, we'll get to Europe data in a second, is that younger citizens are much less likely to consistently support democracy. As they get older and as they age and replace older people, support for democracy will fall. We're at a high water mark right now, and look what's going on. And as core support for democracy falls, the ability of opponents of democracy to activate support grows, as does the probability that they will. Okay, well, that's the United States, and we're talking Europe right now, right? So I have some data from Europe. We looked at 9 countries. This is Foundation International Comms Hub and European Movement International. We looked at 9 European countries. I won't go, well, Romania, Hungary, Poland, Estonia, Germany, Italy, Greece, France, Finland. Yeah, I asked the same questions. Consistency of support for democracy. And in 7 of those 9 countries in 2022, and 8 of those 9 countries in 2023, support for democracy ranged from 22% to 48%. So right around the US number, right? But inconsistent support for consistent support for democracy among young people was, just like the United States, much, much lower than older people. Example, if it's okay to keep going on here, Germany. The average consistent support for democracy, Germans 18 plus. Next time we do it, we'll do 16 plus, given the change in voting. It was 37.5%, average across the board. Young people, 18 to 29-year-olds, less than 20%. 30 to 39-year-olds, just over 20%. So you have a systemic problem here that is only going to grow. And just to add one last thing to it, they'll probably drive you nuts. These are 18 plus. What about 11 to 17? The next, Gen Alpha coming up. Is there any reason for us to think that they're going to be more likely to be consistent supporters of democracy? I would argue no. And I would argue the trend is not our friend here when it comes to democracy. I used to study authoritarianism nonstop because this is the flip side of it. And this is what's going on and why it's creating opportunities for authoritarianism.
It's quite crazy, especially when you know the final result. And I think a lot of people are aware of the final result, but not of all the steps that take you there. But as someone who studied authoritarianism, the writing is on the wall for you. How does that feel to see all of these dynamics unfolding?
Oh, well, it's been absolutely terrifying and absolutely predictable. In 2015, I was finishing up my PhD, okay? As soon as someone says PhD, you should go run away screaming, oh no, he's going to talk about his dissertation. And my dissertation was on authoritarianism. And I did it because everyone in my university said, don't study that, it's dead. It's no longer a viable study. There is no such thing as authoritarianism. I said, there's this incredibly interesting book, Authoritarianism and Polarization, getting to your point, in American politics, which focused on how authoritarianism was driving polarization. And I found it fascinating. So I went and did my thing. And then I did a poll at the end of 2015. I did a poll of Americans who are about to vote in the upcoming presidential election, focused on Democratic primary, Republican primary. And my hypothesis, listening to Trump, was that he was activating authoritarians. And the data came out in early January 2016, before the first primary, and it showed that American authoritarians had been activated by Donald Trump and we're going to vote for him. And I wrote in early 2016, it's in Politico, that Trump has catalyzed authoritarians, and he will win the Republican presidential primaries and has a high likelihood of becoming president of the United States because he has this granite-like base. And that article appeared, and oh my Lord, people are all saying, no, that's not true. You can't use the word authoritarianism, yada, yada. It was an explosion. And the right and attacked my university, actually, shut down our, people didn't like hearing it. But now, obviously, how many years later, actually, even 2 years later, the word authoritarianism has been mainstreamed, and it's people understand it, see it's happening. We also did that same work in Europe and found that behind many of the right parties, authoritarianism was what was driving it, which I found to be disturbing also.
It definitely goes hand in hand, this disconnection from democratic institutions and processes, and the feeling that they're not necessary. In the new sort of situation, security-wise, even at the latest NATO summit, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands explicitly said in one of his statements that the end of history was an illusion, and that we've gone past thinking that we can only stay at this plateau of goodness.
Well, we were in kind of elites, the press, and many people were in a fairyland, living in a fairy tale. They thought authoritarianism was done. We're at this end of history, which was just ridiculous. That democracy had, won the battle, and that we didn't need to worry about what was going on. And that was wrong. Absolutely, positively wrong. I remember I did probably 200 interviews with authoritarians, people who are dispositional authoritarians based on 4, now 8 childbearing questions. So we don't ask someone, are you an authoritarian? People can say, no, I'm not an authoritarian. That's my dad. We ask childbearing questions, which are predictive of authoritarian behaviors, like don't like freedom of speech. I'm scared of that person who doesn't look like me. All those things come out of these child rearing questions. And I remember I went to the Netherlands first and spoke to individuals, did 8 interviews, and the facility that was recruiting for me, they recruit people based on the screener of authoritarian questions. They were aghast. They said, you will not find an authoritarian in the Netherlands. You will not find an authoritarian here. I said, I can find them with these 4 questions. I know. And they came in, and they were the people in the facility and the moderator who was shocked. We did it in Berlin. This was in 2017. And I was told by foundations and others, you cannot find an authoritarian. There'll be no authoritarians in Berlin. Found them like that, the same questions. So authoritarians, people who are disposed to authoritarianism, are always in the population. The question is if they're activated or not. And when they're activated, that is when you start to see, in some cases, not all cases, the great polarization. Because activation is driven by fear. Fear breeds hate. Hate breeds repression. Repression menaces stable governments. That's a 1912 from a Supreme Court dissent in the United States. Fear is what authoritarian leaders use to stoke division. And fear is what they use to define in-group and out-group. Fear, and then a whole bunch of other things like wearing hats or certain garb, you name it. Mass rallies is sort of the penultimate of it. But that fear is incredibly important, fear of the other. And that activates authoritarians who are in the population and then drives polarization because they say, I've got my friends. I don't listen to you. I can't talk to you. You're not like me. So that's what we've seen is this stoking of authoritarianism, this activation of authoritarianism. And you add that to the lower and lowering support for democracy with young people, and you have what we would call a witch's brew, a very, very dangerous set of circumstances. And then you add into that AI, or before that, let's just go to algorithm. We'll start with the A's, all the bad A's. The algorithms that drive division because it drives click, which drives profits. I mean, all of this is set up for a car crash, and we're kind of in the middle. I don't say this happily. I mean, I sound happy sometimes. We're in the middle of it. I wrote yesterday, "Winter's here." After the latest U.S. Supreme Court decision, winter's here, and it's going to be a long one. And I kind of think that's true.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you say that young people are afraid to not, that people tend to not speak to others, be fearful of the out groups. But even like in our part of our study, we interrogated who people talk to, their family, their friends, or online and things like that. And even there's quite a high degree of people who will not discuss polarizing topics with their close ones, with family members, with partners. This closes them in within themselves. What happens to people when they don't discuss these things with anyone else?
Oh, it's very dangerous because they don't discuss them with people, but they are within the conversation online, the echo chamber online. So they become more and more radicalized or more separate from reality. We did a really interesting study with La Intersección in Spain about young men, 16 to I think it was 23, and trying to see who's getting sucked into the manosphere, which is just hate, right? But the hate's playing out in politics, as you know. You saw the AFD, some of the language and thought. Let's not call it thought, bile coming out of the AFD to bring in young men. And what we found is that young men who have family connections and who have friend connections beyond online are much less likely to get sucked into the manosphere because that manosphere can become very all-encompassing, enveloping. And if you're in it, it's hard to get out of it. But if you see it, but also see reality from your family and other connections, you have more perspective and you're less likely to get sucked in.
Of course, if you see people online reducing women to a few stereotypes or motivations or things like that, but then, even if it's someone's sister and you see your sister being a complex human being, you're likelier to believe that women are complex human beings.
Yeah, not just whatever the manosphere does. Well, and manosphere is about power, and it's about polarization, and it's about getting back, not to traditional. I don't think this is traditional. I think this is really toxic that it wants to return to. Toxic power dynamics.
And I'd want to go to, let's say, an ensemble view of the drivers of polarization, because the young people who participated in our study from France and Italy, Germany, Poland, and Denmark point the fingers to the main drivers of polarization as politicians and national governments on the one hand, and also traditional media and social media. So the main pathway to engaging with the world through like mainstream politics, the politicians alienate them. But at the same time, the place where they should be getting information from or where they should be talking to each other in a mass communication context drives them apart. And this creates some very personal emotional experiences and very visceral reactions. And it creates a vicious circle of negativity and of distancing. What would it take to turn this into a virtuous circle?
Well, first, they also have to blame themselves. And we also have to blame the educational system because for some reason, we have not, and I'm not you, it's more my generation, has not proven to young people or given them the information to help them conclude that democracy, while it is totally flawed, is the best system of government out there. But it is a flawed system, but it's the best thing we got. And we've seen the alternatives, and they are not good, right? They are not good. And we see the alternatives in the world right now, and they are not good. How do you overcome this polarization is really the question at hand. And part of it is I can understand as a young person being totally, this system doesn't work for me. I mean, what we see, and it really, your study is really cool and very interesting, by the way. And what we see really resonates with it. Freedom is valued. Young people want freedom, democracy not as much. And the key thing there, they don't think you have to have democracy to have freedom, which is a problem. This is US, but also we're seeing this in Europe to a certain extent. And freedom and democracy not viewed as inextricably linked. And freedom is the really thing that's so valued. That's why in the US election, Biden talked about democracy all the time. People go, so what? Right? Harris started talking about freedom and got big lift from it. She won young people by 4 points, even though young people voting last time were much more conservative than when Biden ran. What else? Democracy is perceived as slow. I got a little cell phone. We all have cell phones here. I can order stuff and get it today. I can order a book and get it today. I can order garden implements and get them today. It's fast. We're in a consumer culture in Europe, in the United States, Canada, that is fast. Things come to us quickly. Democracy doesn't. And then really democracy is failing for a lot of people because it's not representing them, old and young. People look at that and say, the system isn't working for me. And young people see that in Europe. Climate change, obviously, it's an incredible systemic problem, fundamental problem, but government isn't dealing with it in a way that's going to resolve it. Defense wasn't a big problem. Now it is. It's obvious what the Russians would love to do, right? What's government going to do? And what are we going to do for that? So democracy doesn't represent me. It produces undemocratic outcomes, and it produces unstable outcomes. And what do I mean by that? Just look at the Netherlands. Didn't the government just fall again in the Netherlands? You have an election and it falls, election and it falls. It's back and forth. And so for young people, the system is really kind of failing them. So what does the system have to do? I wouldn't say all politicians are failing them. Some politicians are stoking division, but it's really hard to be the politician that says hope. Who was the politician? Barack Obama. Hope is a muscle, but it's really hard when you have the furies of division and fear and someone's getting something and I'm not, all the divisions being stoked. But you got to empower young people. And empower is not setting up a process where they all sit in a room and they come up with a policy statement and it goes to the EU and nothing's ever done about it. Empowering is giving them the ability to, and having a system that listens to them and to us, people my age, so we get real change because we need that real change.
Thank you both for your wonderful insights. I think, especially on a day like the International Day of Democracy, it's important to really have an ensemble view of all of these different factors that go into current polarization. And we still have a couple more Overcoming Polarization episodes coming up in the next few weeks. You can always look out for those. Thank you so much for tuning in, and you'll hear from me next week.